Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And we're on part 2 of our story. And this story has started up where there's a very strange smell in the apartment block, and a young woman is living in this apartment block in New York and is trying to figure out where this strange smell is coming from. And in the story we're beginning to realise about the few friends that she has. She's lived in New York for about 5 years, and she has only 2 very good friends. A friend called Cassandra, who she meets up with regularly for lunch on a Saturday, and she has a friend, an old man who lives above her in the apartment, called George Charlotta. So let's continue with our story. Go on, George.
Well, the following week I left my job in Toronto, didn't I? I didn't have much choice in the matter in the circumstances. I couldn't go into the office every day, with Valerie Harper sniffing around me like a dog on heat. She seemed to think that after the unfortunate episode in the bar on the Friday night, where she practically gave me a lap dance, that we were suddenly going steady. She had heard my wife had kicked me out of the house, so she wanted to get her teeth into me, claim me as her own, so to speak. She began to spout all kinds of nonsense to me.
Oh, George, I'm so sorry about your wife, Monica. You deserve so much better than her,
she said coquettishly, practically thrusting her chest into my face, brushing me with her hands.
You poor, poor man, she said seductively,
brushing her long nail down my cheek.
I'll make it all better for you, George, I promise,
she said, kissing me on the cheek. I physically had to push that annoying woman off me. She was like a blood-sucking leech that I couldn't shake off. Valerie, I'm not interested in you. Your little lap dance you did for me on Friday night in my drunken state has literally ruined my marriage. My wife heard all about it. I'm not proud of myself getting so drunk, but my wife thinks we've been having an affair.
Oh, don't be like that, George, honestly, she purred. Your wife is just jealous. She can't bear it that you find me so attractive. You and I will be so good together, George. I know we will.
I'm not interested in you, Valerie. Now go away. Leave me alone. Valerie gave me a wink.
You know where I am, George, when you've calmed down a little.
I wasn't bad looking back in the day when I was a young man, which made my wife even more distrustful of me. I was glad to leave Toronto for a fresh and brand new start, most especially to get away from the likes of Valerie Harper, who would have loved to have got her claws into me permanently. I came here at the time because I had 2 grandparents living in New York. I moved in with them for a while, until I found a great job in the city. My grandparents were extremely good people, who admitted to me that they had never liked my wife, Monica. They weren't surprised that she'd spat me out with the bathwater.
You were too good for her, George, they told me. Count your blessings she's out of your life. After George had told me his sorry story, I looked at George Charlotta through very empathetic eyes. But I don't understand, George, I said. I mean, some of us get bladdered from time to time, don't we? We all make mistakes in our lives. You made a mistake for just one evening. Why didn't you insist in telling Monica what really happened at the office party? I'm sure she'd have forgiven you. It seems like her nasty girlfriend was hell-bent on breaking you apart.
That girl, Lucy Fenter, did a fine job of ending my marriage for me. But, to be fair, Monica let her do it. You don't know Monica, said George, looking reflective. Forgiveness was not one of her strong redeeming points. In truth, I've never known Monica to forgive anyone for anything. When we got together, I remember she hadn't spoken to her mother for years because of a massive fallout over a car her mother had bought her younger sister. She was resentful she had received nothing, so she chose never to speak to her mother again after that. Her mother apologized profusely, even sent her a check in the post to compensate for the fact that she hadn't bought my wife a car. My wife sent her the check back and said she wanted nothing more to do with her mother. The damage had been done. When her mother died, she never even attended her funeral. I reasoned with her about that when we got married. I told her she should rekindle her relationship with her mother, because you only have one mother, don't you? But she refused point blank. Monica was a tough woman who took no nonsense from anyone. You know the type.
She sounds absolutely awful, George. I'm sorry, but she does. You didn't actually cheat on her, did you? You didn't do anything. That woman just gave you a lap dance. And then she just wants to end the marriage over that. It's insane.
As incongruous as it may sound, I loved Monica to death. But she was an impossible woman. And when I say impossible, I mean impossible. If I got into an argument with her, I always lost, even when I was in the right. Because with Monica, you could never ever win.
I just don't get it, George. I don't understand her at all. I don't understand why she refused to forgive you.
My wife was doggedly stubborn. There was nothing that I could say to convince her of my innocence. I was guilty as far as she was concerned. And I knew that fighting her was a losing battle. Would only make her all the more mad. Ultimately, she would stop me from seeing the kids, which she did anyway. She had very strong views on cheating. On the day we got married, she told me that if I so much as looked at another woman with lust in my eyes, I was a goner. I knew she meant every word of it, but I wasn't remotely concerned, because I only had eyes for her. I always only had eyes for her. But she was a jealous woman, you see. And in the beginning that was rather endearing, until it became like a noose around my neck. She was always accusing me of fancying someone else, which was never true. I'm afraid everything was always about her. She expected to be the centre of the universe in my world, and she was. I gave her everything until it wasn't enough.
I'm sorry, George, I don't know what you saw in her. You gave up on your marriage. You felt defeated by your wife. Surely you could have met somebody else.
I gave up, and I never went out with another woman again. I guess I had too many war wounds. Maybe I thought other women would spit me out like my wife had done. And Valerie Harper had scared me half to death with her outrageous flirtations. I remember I did try to date a couple of times. I arranged to meet women at a local bar on 2 separate occasions, but I chickened out. I got so far as getting to the bar and seeing the woman waiting for me, and I ran out of that bar like a bat out of hell, as I was afraid of my own shadow.
But why would you do that, George? You might have met someone really nice. Then you wouldn't have had to spend all these years on your own.
Well, I still loved Monica, even after everything that had happened. I guess in a way I felt I was cheating on her, seeing someone else, even though I was out of the picture by then. I thought one day that Monica would change her mind and realize that I'd never cheated on her, and that we could get together again and live together, rekindle the flame, so to speak. I was deluding myself. Monica refused to let me see my children. Then she shacked up with another man, whom she eventually kicked out of the house because she described him as a lazy slob. It didn't take much for Monica to abandon you like she did with her own mother. That was what she was like.
You know what, George? I don't think your wife Monica threw you out because of Valerie Harper. I think she spat you out because she got bored. She was looking for an excuse to leave you, like she did with her next boyfriend and her mother. It seems like when she's had enough of you, she just spits you out. I've heard of people like that before, you know.
You may well be right. My wife certainly had a poor tolerance threshold. I remember if I ever left the loo seat up in our home, Monica would have kittens. Anything I did that upset her, she would go ballistic.
Oh, she sounds like the most difficult woman, George. Some people might say you had a lucky escape. I'm inclined to think you did.
That's what I kept telling myself over the years. But let me tell you, I missed my wife, most especially my children, and my life, of course, was never the same once the relationship ended. I suppose over the years I've been rotting away in this apartment, and now I'm an old man with arthritis and a flailing hip. I don't get around easily these days, but I try to make the most of my life. I read a lot to keep myself entertained. I have the occasional tipple, enjoying a bit of brandy from time to time. I also enjoy the occasional smoke from my pipe. But I do get lonely living up here in the apartments. But I enjoy doing a spot of bird watching from this floor. So I don't have it all bad, you know.
But now your daughter Viola has come into your life. You must be so happy about that, George. I bet you never saw that happening. You thought that Monica would never let your children visit you. And then she turns up on your doorstep like that. I mean, that's brilliant news, isn't it?
It is brilliant news, but it's baby steps at the moment,
said George, a twinkle appearing in his eyes.
Viola arrived on my doorstep about 6 months ago. I was so thrilled to see her. I couldn't believe it. She lives in Canada, you see. It's a long way from here for her to come. She lives in Canmore in Alberta. It's in Alberta's Rocky Mountains close to Calgary, with the craggy summits of the Three Sisters. Besides that, I've since learnt that I'm a grandfather. I have grandchildren. My son Finn has 2 adult children, and Viola has 2 children whom I've never met. A young man called Luca, who's round about your age, I suspect. He's about 27. And then there's his sister Farrell, who's 25. Viola's shown me pictures of the 2 of them. They're very attractive young people.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that, George. Your daughter certainly lives in an idyllic part of the world.
It sure is idyllic, George admitted.
So what happened when you saw Viola at your doorstep? Did you actually know it was her, George?
George chuckled. No, I didn't. In truth, I thought she was someone trying to sell me something. We'd recently had these salesmen infiltrate the apartment block, determined to give us a demonstration on the latest hoovers that they were hoping people would buy. I mean, what am I going to do with a great big hefty hoover in a place like this? I assumed Viola was part of the team that was knocking on people's doors offering demonstrations on these hoovers. I said, no, I'm not interested. I'm sure your hoovers are great, but no thank you very much. Viola looked at me in the doorway through her steely grey eyes and said,
Dad, you're not interested in getting to know your own daughter better, are you? Don't you recognise me, Dad? It's Viola. That must have been an incredible moment, George, seeing your daughter standing there for the first time after so many years. I can't imagine what that was like for you. I suspect in your mind's eye, she was still the little girl you'd remembered all those years ago. I know that people never age in your own mind when you haven't seen them for a long time.
That's exactly right, said George, rubbing his chin reflectively. The last time I saw my little girl, she was 7. So it was an incredible moment seeing her as a mature woman. Like you say, I always thought of her as a cheeky little 7-year-old. I reconciled myself to the fact that my ex-wife had poisoned my kids against me, so that I would never see them again. And you know what? I was at peace with that.
How could you be at peace with that, George? I'm so sorry, but you had a right to see your children.
Well, I decided not to fight for my rights. As the kid's father in court, I didn't want any ugly business, or to create a stink. I thought when the children were old enough they would likely look me up on their own if they wanted a relationship with their father. I wrote to them all the time, sent them a plethora of cards and presents for birthdays and Christmases. I sent Monica maintenance checks every single month, but I never heard a dicky bird from any of my children, apart from Monica, who kept me abreast on what the kids wanted for birthdays and Christmases, that sort of thing. When my children never contacted me, I accepted my sad lot like you do. So when I saw Viola standing in the doorway, I was frozen to the spot for a moment, opening and closing my mouth like a stunned goldfish. I then asked her to come in, when I began to calm down from the shock of seeing her. In that moment, I don't think I have felt so much joy as I did then. We fell into each other's arms and Viola sobbed into my shirt, apologizing that she hadn't looked me up for a very long time. She believed her mother had poisoned her mind against me. I assured her it wasn't too late for us to get to know each other again, and that seems to have brought her considerable comfort. So that's what we're doing at the moment, getting to know each other better. It was surprising looking at Viola and being able to see myself in her. We have the same chin and the same hooded eyes.
How old is Viola, George, if you don't mind my asking you?
Let's see. I think she must be about 57 years old. Yes, that's about right. She chose to look me up after my ex-wife Monica had died from lung cancer. I had no idea she'd passed away. That was news to me. But if anything was going to get her, it would have been the cigarettes. She was a heavy smoker. She had been smoking cigarettes like a chimney since she was a teenager. When I married Monica, I was very concerned about her health, because she was even wheezing back then. So I hid her cigarettes from her regularly, and it would make her as mad as a March hare. I would say to her, "These are going to kill you, Monica." And she would say,
"I'd rather have a shorter life, George, and smoke than miss out on a cigarette."
So I guess in the end she got her wish, did she not?
"She sure did, George," I said. "So your daughter Viola looks you up only after Monica dies. What had Monica told her about you?"
"That was the interesting part," chuckled George. "My wife Monica spun a web of lies about me to both Viola and Finn. I'm not surprised they never looked me up. According to Monica, I was a womanizer that spent my life chasing after women, and I was permanently bladdered, always 2 sheets to the wind. She told them I was probably lying passed out in a ditch somewhere, after a drunken brawl in the bar. She had done everything to poison my children's minds against me. So my son Finn naturally wanted nothing to do with me. But Viola, well, she was different. She was still rather curious about me. She had still decided that after her mother died, she would look me up, and that's what she did."
"It sounds like Viola didn't buy everything that her mother told her about you, George."
"Well, Viola was a very astute woman. She told me Monica was a big exaggerator when she was growing up. So Viola wanted to look me up herself after her mother died, to find out what really happened between us all those years ago. Monica had told them I wanted nothing to do with them, when the reverse was actually true. She told her children that I hadn't sent any maintenance checks to her when they were young, but I had done so religiously every month without fail. I'd also sent my kids a plethora of letters, cards, Christmas presents and birthday presents, and Monica passed those off as her own. It was hardly surprising that Viola and Finn must have had a very dim view of me as their father in that regard. They must have thought I didn't care a toss about them."
"Well, at least you can get to know your daughter a whole lot better now," I said encouragingly. "Not all is lost, George. It's not too late for any of that."
"Well, that is true. I'm a very happy man to have been reunited with my daughter. We've shed lots of tears together, looked at photographs and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, my son Finn lives in Australia, so I'm unlikely to see him any time soon."
"Who knows, George? Maybe he'll come out from Australia to see you himself. Stranger things have happened." It was ironic because I was thinking about George Charlotta when I returned to bed that night on the week I'd failed to visit him, and the strange smell was lingering along the corridors of the Forsyth apartment block. I had gone to bed with a glass of wine and a detective novel, blindly oblivious of what was to unfold the following morning. I was surprised that the image of George Charlotta, for reasons I cannot explain, kept popping into my head, rudely reminding me of my failings. I was feeling bad. I hadn't visited George due to the mountain of work at the offices that had cruelly yanked away my energy reserves and had me returning to the flat rather late in the evening. I was too exhausted to look in on my upstairs neighbour, who was living in the flat above me, and all I'd wanted to do when I came back home was to flop onto the couch and fall fast asleep. I didn't know many people in our apartment block, beyond George Charlotta and a few of the kids I'd see playing regularly on the stairwell. I did know people by their familiar faces and by the cars they drove, and we would exchange pleasantries as you do. But beyond that, people lived busy lives here and kept themselves very much to themselves. So as I sat up in bed that night, sipping on my wine, I'd heard some strange banging sounds above my head and a few mumbled voices chatting away in earnest. The noise was coming from George Charlotta's apartment. I wondered if George had visitors. I heard a scurry of people run down the stairs, and then all went very quiet, and I forgot about it. It was only the following morning, as I pottered lackadaisically in the kitchen to make coffee on a Saturday, that I heard the loud voices again on the stairwell, and it is what they were saying that demanded my prompt attention.
"It's on the 6th floor. You can't miss it. You'll know which one it is by the smell and the flies."
What was going on, I wondered. I walked over to my front door and very gingerly opened it, just to a little crack, so that I could eavesdrop in on the conversation. I observed 2 men dressed in white coveralls climbing up the stairwell. One stood on a step talking to an older lady whom I'd seen her round and about from time to time. It was what they were saying that turned my blood to ice.
"So it was you, ma'am, that called the police, was it?"
came the male voice, belonging to a man dressed in the white plastic coveralls. "Yes, the smell was so bad, and I saw flies all over that apartment. I knew something was up."
"I'm very sorry, ma'am, that you had to witness that. It's never easy, is it? The flies and the smell are usually a huge giveaway."
"It's George I feel sorry for. He was such a lovely old man, you know. Kept himself to himself. It must have been awful for him dying alone like that in the apartment. The people who live next door to him are away, you see, and the flat on his other side is being refurbished by the landlord. It's not occupied at present. Otherwise, I think he may have been discovered sooner. If someone had been in, maybe they'd have noticed something wasn't right. Dying on your own like that, I just can't imagine. Poor George."
"It happens a lot, ma'am, here in New York. Every day people die alone. It's not that unusual. Several thousand every year, as it happens, die on their own. Their bodies are discovered rather late in the day, but it's the smell that usually gives them away."
"Why do you think he died like he did? I know he had a bad hip. He was waiting to have hip replacement surgery, you know. Do you think he took a nasty fall?"
"It's a possibility, ma'am. His body was found at the base of the staircase. So after the autopsy report, they'll be able to find out what happened with him. We're simply the clean-up team, so we have to throw contaminated material away. Body fluids, stuff like that, if you know what I mean. It's not a pretty job, but someone's got to do it. We're going to be removing the floorboards and any contaminated material that needs to be disposed of, that is regarded as hazardous waste."
"Oh, how dreadful! I can't imagine what kind of a job that must be for you."
"You get used to it, ma'am, and it pays very well. Thanks to you, the body was taken to the mortuary last night. It could have been worse."
"Well, you know, everybody was complaining about the horrific smell in the apartments. The kids didn't want to play on the stairwell. I thought something was rotting, you know. We have a lady living in this building that smuggles in stray cats. She's got dozens of them in her apartment. I thought one of them might have fallen ill and died, which was why I went to investigate the smell. But when I saw the flies at George's window, and I kept knocking at the door and got no answer, I knew he was dead. I just feel dreadfully bad for the poor old man. George was a lovely man, you know. I think he'd had a hard life. He was estranged from his family, that sort of thing. He was initially from Canada, Toronto, I believe. Wife divorced him a long time ago." I quickly closed the door behind me. My heart was thundering a dime to a dozen. I was in such a state of shock as tears spilled down my cheeks. I realized my good friend George Charlotta was dead, and the smell that had been hovering around our apartments had come from his deceased corpse, and all the flies that had been coming into my apartment were because of George Charlotta. The thought of George dying alone grieved my heart greatly. I now felt incredibly guilty that I'd failed to pay him a visit during the week. But now he was gone. There was not much I could do about it any more. I couldn't do anything to redeem myself. I couldn't imagine what it must have been like for him to die alone. I could only hope that it was a sudden death that he never saw coming. I'd hate to think he might have suffered in silence, being unable to call anyone for help, and dying on the floor, unable to get the attention of absent neighbours. The more I thought about this, the more I chastised myself for failing to visit him. It was a short while later that there was a knock at my door. I reluctantly opened it, and there were 2 men in white, the men that I'd seen earlier on in the stairwell, now standing in my doorway. I knew they were part of the clean-up crew that had been recruited to clean up after George Charlotta. But what were they doing at my door, I wondered.
"Hello, ma'am. I'm very sorry to disturb you."
"How can I help you?" I asked.
"We're the clean-up crew, cleaning up after a dead corpse, I'm afraid. The man who lived in the apartment directly above you has died. His body was decomposing for a week before it was found by one of the residents. I'm sure you must have noticed the foul smell around the place. It could, of course, have been a great deal worse, but luckily George Charlotta's air conditioning was on cold, so it delayed his decomposition, which is most fortunate because after the heat wave we've had, it certainly doesn't do any favours when it comes to dead bodies, as you can imagine."
"Yes, I did notice the nasty smell, but I had no idea it was a dead body. George was a great friend of mine. I'm very, very sad he's gone."
"I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, if that is the case."
"How can I help you?" I asked them.
"I'm afraid, ma'am, we need to remove a ceiling of yours. It seems that some of the deceased body fluids have seeped through your ceiling, which we are going to have to replace. We have informed your landlord about the matter, and he's given us the go-ahead to do the job. It is hazardous waste material that needs to be disposed of at once."
"Oh, yes, I noticed there was some brown stuff leaking through the ceiling in the hallway," I told them, feeling horrified that something I had mistaken for rust was probably George Charlotta's body fluids. How could I not have realised what was going on above my head? How could I have been so foolish? It was a while later, after the clean-up team had left and successfully refitted my ceiling, that there was a knock at the door. A very elegant, well-made-up woman in her late 50s stood in my doorway. It would seem on this Saturday morning I had received my fair share of unexpected visitors. I wondered who the woman was. She stood in the doorway and just sobbed. I insisted she came into the kitchen while I made her a sweet cup of tea. At this point in time, I had no clue who she was. But you have to invite someone sad into your house, because what else can you do? I did reason she might be a friend of George Charlotta's, and had just only learnt the grievous news. That had to be it. "Are you all right?" I asked her, as I handed her a mug of tea. "I've put in 3 sugars. Is that sweet enough?" "I can't believe it," said the woman, staring vacantly into space. "I got here this morning to visit my father, and I've just found out that he's died. Oh, my goodness, I can't believe he's dead. I just can't believe it. I'm in shock. It's so unfair. I've only started to get to know him after all these years. I wanted my children to meet him, and my brother Finn, who lives in Australia. There was so much catching up we needed to do, and now this has to happen. My father, he was healthy, you know, but he had a bad hip, a touch of arthritis. So him dying like this, without due warning, is so grievously upsetting. How could this have happened?" "Oh, my goodness gracious! You must be Viola, George Charlotta's daughter. Goodness gracious me, I can't believe I'm meeting you now. He's told me so much about you, how you've been rekindling your relationship, what you mean to him. He's been so terribly excited about your impromptu arrival in his life. It's brought him so much joy. Oh, I'm so dreadfully sorry for your loss. I just don't know what to say." Well, I came to see you because my father told me all about you. I gather you're the only person in this apartment block that would visit him sometimes twice a week. I wanted to thank you personally for that. I also wanted I don't know what I wanted to do. Look at me. I'm blubbering in front of you. What must you think of me? My father was a very lonely man, you see. Your visits meant the world to him. When he told me about you, I was heartily relieved to know that someone was looking out for him. It can be terribly lonely in New York, you know. I felt a heat rising up from my neck to my face. I hung my head in shame. I'm so sorry, Viola. I meant to visit your father this last week. It is true. I usually visit him twice a week. Can you believe that? Twice a week I've been visiting your dad. But this week I didn't visit him at all. Everything got on top of me at work. The managers were just throwing so much work my way, and it just consumed me. I now feel completely awful because he died all on his own. Even though I noticed an increase in flies and a foul stench around the place, but I never figured out what was going on. I feel like I let you down badly, and I let, George down. I'm just so sorry. I feel dreadful. Viola began to sob, so I handed her some tissues. Don't mind me. This is just such a dreadful shock. And you have been visiting my father twice a week, and the fact that you missed this last week doesn't matter at all. The main thing is you've been a good friend to him, so please don't blame yourself for any of this. I was getting to know my dad better after years of being estranged from him, and then this has to happen. Why does life have to be so unfair? My mother made out that my father was the most terrible man. Can you believe that? Oh, she turned us against him, she did. I believed all her lies about him. And all this time, a nicer man you could never hope to meet. George was incredible. When I realized I'd missed out so many years of my life with him, I was so upset. I honestly wished that he'd taken my mother to court and insisted on making us a part of his life. But it wasn't to be. He was just such a gentleman in every sense of the word. He didn't want to cause chaos and conflict. My mother was the reverse, of course, in every way. Well, I said, you know the saying, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Your mother must have been a very bitter woman. Maybe something happened to her in her life that made her like this. I heard somewhere that we can be a product of our childhoods, and I think it's true. Viola looked at me through red eyes. She wiped away the debris of her tears. Did George tell you what happened with my mother? It turned out he never cheated on her all those years ago. She made a mountain out of a molehill over a woman flaunting herself at my dad when he was drunk in a bar. It's so typical of my mother to overreact to something that was so benign. I mean, only my mother would divorce someone over the most ridiculous things. I nodded. I'm so sorry, Viola, about everything. George did tell me the story, so I know all about it. I thought your mother was incredibly unreasonable. She didn't give George a chance to tell his side of the story. She just believed her friend's account. It was ridiculous. Viola began to sniff again. She dabbed her wet eyes with a tissue. My mother was never an easy woman, you know. Growing up, I didn't trust my mother's account of my father. Not really. But while she was alive, I felt I would be betraying her if I looked Dad up, although I was very tempted to do so. I knew there were two sides to this story. It would have upset my mother exponentially if I'd contacted George. She'd have seen that as an incredible betrayal on my part. So once she was gone, I knew I had to look up my father, to get his side of the story, because something always felt off. That couldn't have been easy for you, I said sympathetically. What is not easy is all the lies my mother told me. So many of them. She painted my father out to be a lecherous drunk. Can you believe that? My only regret is I didn't look up my father a long time ago. All this time when she said Dad wanted nothing to do with us, which was very hurtful to hear growing up,
as a child, as you can imagine. I remember thinking that there had to be something dreadfully wrong with me, if my father wanted nothing to do with me at all, or my brother Finn. And all the time, none of that was true. I wondered why my father never remembered our birthdays and Christmases, why he never got in touch with us. I used to cry my heart out about not having a proper father growing up. It was when I was cleaning up my mother's house, after she died. I stumbled across shoeboxes and shoeboxes of birthday cards for me and my brother Finn, all from my father. There were hundreds of these, including a plethora of letters with New York postal marks on them. He had written to us so many times over the years. We never received any of those letters. They were so beautiful. When I opened them up and read them, I cried and cried. My mother kept this all from us. I suspect she knew if we read them, we'd warm to our father. She didn't want that to happen. I mean, how could she do that to us, to her own children? Viola blew her nose loudly into her tissue, wiped away her tears. It was a cruel thing for her to do. When I read those letters, I knew at once my father was a very good man. So I came up from Canada to pay him an impromptu visit. Let me tell you, he was more than a little bewildered to see me in the doorway. It was an emotional reunion of note. I felt like the hole in my life had been filled.
That's a very cruel thing for a mother to do, I said. Your mother, Monica, made you believe that your father had washed his hands of you, when the reverse was actually true. That really sucks. It wasn't just that. I discovered my dad had been sending my mother very generous maintenance checks over the years, when she claimed he had never contributed anything to our upkeep. Of course, I knew nothing of this as a child. Dad phoned the house several times, you know, to chat to me and my brother Finn. My mother put down the phone on him on such occasions. I do recall once answering the telephone, and a man's voice at the other end said, "Is that you, Viola?" My mother snatched the phone away from me. She said it was the wrong number. I told her that the man knew my name, and my mother said, "He must have thought that you were another Viola. That man certainly did not want to speak to you." She'd tell us over the years, "Your father wants nothing to do with you, Viola. He's a miserable old sod, he is." My mother would pass off his beautiful Christmas presents to us as her own gifts. Can you believe that? I mean, how low can you actually get? So are you saying that presents you thought were from your mother were actually from George? That's exactly what I'm saying. The funny thing about my mother, Monica, was she was never very generous. She was rather tight, you know. Certainly when it came to parting with her cash, she was. She'd fuss if we wanted anything expensive. So every birthday and Christmas when we received an expensive gift from her that was really from my father, both me and my brother Finn thought that my mother wasn't so tight after all. We had no idea the presents we received were never from her in the first place. My father even wrote to my mother, asking what we wanted for our birthdays and Christmas. She'd send him long lists of what we wanted, and then take credit for everything he bought for us. She'd have claimed to have gone out and brought those things for us herself, and we believed her whopping lies. And believe me, they were whopping. Well, I expect relationships can be complicated, I said, trying to be diplomatic. Your mother hated your father and wanted you to feel the same way about him. If you knew your dad had sent you cards and presents every year and was paying regular maintenance checks, you would have had a very different opinion of him, wouldn't you? Too right, I would have. I suppose she didn't want us to be curious about our father or to like him at all. And so she was determined to make him seem like a really bad person. It suited her agenda. I shrugged my shoulders nonchalantly. Well, at least you know the truth now, Viola. The truth always comes out in the end, doesn't it? You know now that your father George was an exceptionally kind man. It was a privilege to know him. I think your mother was extremely unreasonable about him. Unreasonable was my mother's middle name. She was unreasonable about everything. She kicked our stepfather out, you know.
describing him as a great big lumbering sloth that was getting on her tits. Yes, those were the words she used. My mother was not subtle about anything. I remember coming home one day to see piles of bin bags outside our front door. And I'm talking about piles of them. I thought my mother was having a spring clean. I decided to peek into those bin liners, and they contained all of Laurie's stuff. I couldn't understand why my mother had thrown out his stuff. And in that moment, I hadn't connected the dots. To my horror, I realized she'd changed the locks to our front door, so that when Laurie got home, the man couldn't get in. Laurie was the closest thing I had to a father at the time. He'd lived with my mother for many years. I couldn't understand why she threw out his stuff so indiscriminately. I failed to connect the dots. To my horror, I was soon to realize she'd changed the locks to our front door. So when Laurie returned home, he couldn't get in. My mother shouted all manner of abuse at him, telling him never ever to come back, that she wanted nothing to do with him. Me and my brother were grievously upset about the whole wretched business. We liked Laurie very much. We saw him as a father figure in our lives, and he certainly hadn't done anything to deserve my mother's abysmal treatment of him. He certainly was not the lazy slob my mother described. My brother Finn told my mother he hated her, as he was attached to Laurie, and my mother was dumping him and discarding him like the old potato peelings after dinner, that sort of thing. Laurie was pleading my mother to let him into the house, assuring her he would mend his ways, but my mother was having none of it. "Get your things and go, Laurie. You're a good-for-nothing slob. I never want to see your face again." And that was that. We watched poor Laurie pick up his stuff, pack it up in the car, driving away. A few months later I saw him in town, arm in arm with another woman, you know. My mother was furiously jealous. The woman he was with was so much more attractive than she was. I hasten to say, Laurie looked happier than I'd ever seen him with my mother. I couldn't blame him for that. He was pleased to see me and my brother Finn, insisting on buying us ice creams, while my mother went off in a huff. Laurie dropped us off at home later after we'd enjoyed ice creams with him and the new lady in his life, who was so sweet. My mother screeched like a banshee when we returned home, saying that Laurie was a jerk. But she was green at the gills with envy. I think she might have realized she was too hasty dumping a good man like Laurie, but far too proud to have to admit it to herself. After that, my mother never got involved with a man again, although for some reason she always attracted very decent men into her life, that she always treated like dirt. She said that men let you down, could never be trusted, and she told me if I knew what was good for me, I'd never ever get married. But I was hardly going to listen to my mother, take advice from her, given what a train smash she'd made of her own life. I have to say, Viola, it sounds that it was a repeat performance on your mother's part, the way she threw your father out, and then Laurie out. Well, I think you're right about that, dear. A leopard never changes its spots. It's all so desperately sad, I said. Well, it sure is. I feel such a mishmash of emotions, said Viola. When I think about it, there is a part of me that wants to wring my mother's neck for her vicious lies about my father. Another part of me wants to wring my own neck for believing all those lies and being so damn gullible. I knew my mother was a huge exaggerator. Telling lies came to her as naturally as breathing. Then I guess I'm mad at myself for not having persuaded my father to move to Canada so we could get to know him a whole lot better. I have a little cottage on our property, you see. I wanted him to live there, and he was thinking about moving there, and now this has to happen to put a spanner in the works. Life can be so dreadfully unfair sometimes. I know, and I'm so sorry about George's death. If it's any consolation, at least you got to know him before he died. And that's got to count for something. It's lucky you found all the letters and cards he wrote you. Your mother stashed them away. She could have thrown them out, you know. Perhaps it was a good thing she hoarded so much stuff. You realise now how much your father really loved you and Finn. I suppose you're right, said Viola. I just wish Finn could have met him. He lives in Australia, you know, and was going to fly over here in 6 months to meet our father. When I told him about all the letters that our dad had sent us over the years, he was absolutely mortified that we had missed out on a relationship with him. So he is going to be so gutted when he learns that George is dead. I don't know how I'm going to tell him about that. He's not going to take this very well. Then there's my 2 children to consider, who are round about your age. They're going to be gutted to know that they will never get to meet their grandfather. This is most unfortunate."
Viola began to sniff again, and then she looked up at me with a glint of hope in her eyes.
"You are going to come to George's funeral, aren't you, Adeline? Please say you will come. I know it would have meant a lot to George if you were there. It's only going to be a few people. I'm going to organise a family plot where I want Dad to be buried. It's the least I can do to give him a very good send-off, don't you think? I know Canada may be a long way to come for you, but I'll pay for your petrol and flight. I just believe you were one of Dad's few friends while living here in New York. It would mean an awful lot to him if you were to come. Have you been to Canada before?"
"No, I haven't," I admitted. "But I understand it's really beautiful. I've seen pictures of Lake Louise. I've always wanted to go there. I mean, is the water really turquoise in colour?"
"It is turquoise," said Viola with a grin. "You will love Canada, Adeline. Can you get any time off work?"
"I can get a week off, I suppose."
"Well, take some time off, for goodness sake, Adeline. I'm sure you work terribly hard here in New York City. A break would do you a great deal of good. And then you'll be able to come to the funeral as well. It'll be wonderful to have you there. You are so welcome to stay in the cottage I would have given George. You can enjoy some independence in that cottage. You won't want us breathing down your neck all the time. But we would love to have you as our guest. I'd like you to meet my brother Finn from Australia. I'm sure he's going to fly out for the funeral when he hears the dreadful news. We'll have fun together. I'll take you all around Alberta. My son can do that as well, you know. You can meet my 2 children, who are around and about your age. So I'm quite sure you're going to have a lot in common with them. In that case, I don't see how I can refuse. It sounds like an offer that I'm going to have to say yes to," I said.
So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.